Excavations in Egypt have uncovered the remains of a variety of races of peoples who began moving in at the beginning of the dynastic period. Again quoting ancient empires, physically these peoples differed unmistakably from the pre-dynastic Egyptians, whereas the latter were unusually small in stature and possessed long and narrow skulls, about 132 millimeters in breadth. The newcomers were more massively built, and their skulls, about 139 millimeters in width, were appreciably broader than those of their predecessors.
Although the origin of these immigrants is unclear from purely fossil finds, Semitic elements began to appear in the vocabulary of the Egyptian language, and it is likely these newcomers brought it with them. Semitic language elements appeared in Egyptian or Egypt after the first dynasty began with Narmer, who ruled about 3100 BC and are not found prior to that date.
The existence of ancient peoples living in Egypt has been well established. The pre-dynastic period in Egypt dates to 4000 BC. There is also evidence of population concentrations in the floodplain of the Nile dating as far back as 6000 to 5000 BC. The building of the Aswan Dam encouraged salvage programs in that area that uncovered a virtual uninterrupted sequence of occupation from the Paleolithic to the Mesolithic in southern Egypt, that is, from about 30,000 to 10,000 BC.
Not to belabor the point, but there is also evidence that the Nile Valley was first explored perhaps as early as 700,000 years ago by some of our ancient predecessors.
Alexander Winchell was professor of geology, zoology, and botany at the University of Michigan from 1855 to 1873, and chair of the Geology and Paleontology Department from 1879 to 1891. Writing in 1888, Winchell found the wanderings of Noah's sons and all their kin does not embrace more than 1/15 of the territory which we now find populated by man. Bristling at the intractable theological establishment, Winchell made a caustic comment on Genesis 10. Was this an attempt to explain the origin of all the nations of the world? Does this genealogical map imply that the regions beyond its limits were then unoccupied by human beings? Does it mean that the various tribes and nations which are now spread over the earth have arisen from the wider dispersion of the sons of Noah? Had the black tribes of Africa and Australia and Melanesia and the brown nations of Asia and America and Polynesia been produced from the posterity of Noah during the interval which separates us from the flood? Yes, yes, says the Catechism, which under cover of a religious instruction assumes to indoctrinate our children in ethnological science. Yes, yes, says the commentator, who experiences no difficulty in swallowing the exegetical and indigestible crudities which have been the heirlooms of the Church for 2,000 years. Yes, 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 exclaims too unanimously the modern teacher of divine truth, all unconscious that the science of ethnology has made visible advances since Jerusalem was the center of the world. Winchell ended his tirade against the establishment with, "To all these questions, I reply in the negative."
Just to add a footnote, Winchell's attitude may have been less strident if he had known he, too, had reached an erroneous conclusion. Drawing on his accumulated knowledge of anthropology of the late 1800s, Winchell could see that Adam came too late in history to start the human race, but he did believe mistakenly that Adam was the first Caucasian.
Unfortunately, mistaken conclusions have plagued this issue for many hundreds of years, and Winchell is just one more casualty proving that old adage, "A little learning can be a dangerous thing." We have pointed out frequently in these episodes that the establishment of racial characteristics in humans long preceded the Neolithic period in which Genesis places Adam.
So at least we've learned something within the past 130 years?
Well, at least some of us have learned something.
In addition to the relatively recent migrations of the descendants of Ham, less than 5,000 years ago, presenting an insurmountable obstacle, the confines of these populations and the greater Near East precludes them from being forerunners to the black Africans, for example, as has been advocated by many Bible interpreters.
Postulating the Caucasian race as emanating from Japheth is equally fraught with difficulty. Cro-Magnon men were Caucasoid based on their cranial traits. Associated tools and fragments of fossil animal bone date a Cro-Magnon site in France to the Pleistocene period 30,000 years ago. And no one yet has proposed any descendant of Noah's three sons who could have been ancestral to the Native Americans, whose fossil remains date to as early as 11,600 years ago in New Mexico, and who may have crossed the Bering Strait during the last ice age 40,000 to 12,000 years ago, when there was a land bridge.
The Chinese civilization also has traces into the distant past. Recent archaeological findings in China have confirmed the antiquity of the Chinese culture.
This quote is from Ascent to Civilization. Until recently, the Chinese Neolithic has given the impression of appearing fully fledged at about 5000 BC. But earlier stages of the story are now becoming apparent. Shenzhengtung, a site in Jiangxi, appears to be older than 6800 BC.
The Japanese were ancient settlers from mainland China, easily seen from morphological similarities. The Japanese language, when it came to be developed, is entirely different from Chinese languages, indicating they separated and settled the island of Japan prior to the advent of a spoken language, at least among this particular race. Just this fact alone should put an end to speculation that all existing populations and languages worldwide can be traced to Noah's descendants.
The Australian Aborigines settled the land down under at least 38,000 years ago. They, among others, cannot be seen to have Noahic ancestry, especially when we know the world had over 80 million people in residence 1,000 years before the flood, who are considered ancestral to modern-day human beings.
The Assyrian example may be typical of the incursion pattern that ensued when the sons of Noah sought new homelands. When Asher and his entourage journeyed north and discovered Nineveh, they found an established city that had existed long before they arrived. This could be seen from the change in pottery with the arrival of the Semites.
Although peaceful cohabitation may have been a possibility, it is more in keeping with the warlike posture of the Assyrians, who terrorized their neighbors for many centuries, to postulate that the indigenous males encountered by the Semite intruders were dispatched by the sword, although we don't like to think about it. Females and maybe small children were spared and became part of the Assyrian culture.
A similar pattern of expansion can be seen in the conquest of South and Central America by the Spanish conquistadors of the 16th century.
Susa was the primary city of ancient Persia, which began as a population center as far back as 4000 BC, clearly a pre-flood date, and at roughly the same time the Sumerians arrived in the West. This time frame is designated Susa I by archaeologists, and for historical purposes is called simply prehistoric. Relics taken from this period include carved figurines, but no written tablets. Susa II began at 3500 BC and was named the Proto-Literate period when writing on clay tablets began to appear. Beginning at 3100 BC, the historical period called Proto-Elamite coincided with the archaeological period Susa III.
Artifacts found at Susa on the Iranian plateau, dating as far back as 3200 BC, were dubbed Proto-Elamite by archaeologists who thought Susa had been founded by Semites after the flood. Clay tablets recovered at Susa revealed a different story. The inscriptions were in a language entirely unknown, unrelated to Semitic, Sumerian, or any other known languages, and have remained untranslated to this day.